Welcome. My name is James Sparrow. I'm the Master of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division. I'm also a member of the History faculty, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Friday conversation, What Does a Democratic Public Look Like? Joining me are Andreas Glaeser from the Sociology Department, Genevieve Lakier from the Law School, and Leila Brammer from the Parrhesia program in the college. This event is co-sponsored by the Center on Democracy and the Parrhesia program. And it's part of a larger program that we're launching under the auspices of the democracy curriculum. Since Leila will be running the show, once I'm done with this brief introduction, I'll have her introduce the Parrhesia program, but I'd like to just give you a few brief words about the democracy curriculum. This is a new initiative in the college that seeks to return democratic questions to the center of the curriculum, where they once resided before Cold War ideology exhausted democracy as a foundation for civics. We have lots of courses that take up democracy as a theme in their syllabi, but we really have very little, almost no programmatic elements of the curriculum that offer a structured intellectual pathway for thinking about democracy in a critical mode, as opposed to a sort of exhortative civic mode. So the democracy curriculum seeks to bring those democratic questions back into the center of the curriculum and into the center of undergraduate life where they once resided. And so as a consequence, the democracy curriculum, which is located in the Center on Democracy and run by a faculty board, the democracy curriculum is taking up new elements that it hopes to introduce into the curriculum, including a new entry in the core curriculum titled Democracy, Equality, Liberty, and the People's Government, which is part of a larger effort to introduce new elements into the core curriculum, and a new minor that the faculty committee will be working on in hopes of introducing it a year from now. Part of our portfolio in the democracy curriculum includes events like this one, although in recent years, they've been more, more focused on events that are tied to the social sciences core. 2 years ago, we had Art Goldhammer, who produced one of the most lucid translations of Tocqueville's Democracy in America into English, lead a set of events that were really quite stimulating and tied into students' coursework in the Soc Core. We also had a blogging initiative as a competition for public writing around democratic questions, the winners of whom were published in TR21, the Tocqueville Review's online blog. We did that again last year for the event around the book Climate Leviathan by Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright, who are critical geographers taking up Hobbes' political theory for our age of climate change. And finally, we had a talk with Jill Frank, political theorist, on Plato's handling of lies and tyranny in the Republic. So you see, most of these initiatives are tied to taking up timely themes and relating them to the ostensibly timeless themes of the Soc Core. But now that the democracy curriculum is fully housed in the Center on Democracy and has its own faculty board, we're now aiming for a broader spectrum set of events. And the event that you're about to experience today is one of those. We're open to suggestions for other ideas that we might pursue, sort of public-facing events that have a serious intellectual focus around democracy that draw on the expertise of our faculty and instructors, but are really timely and focused on contemporary concerns pressing at the moment. Please feel free to contact Kevin Cromash, who works with us in the Center on Democracy to run the center and to run the curriculum. He'll be happy to take your suggestions and we'll consider them before the faculty board. Please also feel free to consult our website, which is at democracy.uchicago.edu/democracy-curriculum. And you can get more detail on the curriculum. But with that, I'm going to hand you over to Leila Brammer and thank our panelists in advance for what I know will be a very stimulating and timely conversation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event. I'm Leila Brammer. I'm director of the Parrhesia program for public discourse. Our mission is to foster productive, inclusive, and rigorous public discourse on campus and in communities. We have a curriculum, we have programming. This is one example of our programming, and I just want to cut right to the program that you came for. In talking with Kevin about the moment we were in with the public sphere, with democracy, with technology, with all of the events that were happening, we wanted to design an event that would actually engage you all in talking about how you see the public sphere evolving and what you think what would create an even more robust or better public sphere. So the way that we've set up this event is we have two speakers who will share with us some of their perspectives and expertise. And then we want to have a really robust discussion in which you tease out and really wrestle with some of those considerations, and then come back together and really talk with our experts and think about those tensions and concerns and constraints that we have within the system. So with that as the setup for what we're going to do, let me introduce our speakers who will be starting us off on this fine afternoon. From the Department of Sociology, we have Professor Andreas Glaeser, who will be sharing with us. And then from the law school, we have Professor Genevieve Lakier, who will share with us her perspectives as well. Andreas, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, of course. And here I'll just bring up a couple of slides that I've prepared for my presentation today. I want to make this a maybe unusual presentation in the sense that I want to really go back to theory and think, sort of through democratic public. So, so I will really focus on the question about how can we think about them, rather than giving answers to any particular kinds of questions such as Trump and Twitter, which we can then later use these models to think to answer them. So I want to make my argument in 5 steps. First, I want to ask who and what are we as human beings? So I really want to start very early on, and you'll just see in a second why I want to begin so deep. Then ask second, what are institutions and why do they matter to us as human beings? 3, what is politics and what is its relation to institutions? This is a very tight relation, it's very important for the argument. 5, then what are public spheres in politics and what role do they play for it? And 5, then finally, is to raise on the basis of these deliberations, of what a democratic public sphere could possibly look like. So 17th century liberalism's idea of what human beings are still dominates Western cultures. Human beings are by nature, they thought then, and so many still think today. So if you just think about the libertarians today in the United States, that they are by nature autonomous and self-sufficient individuals, except in infancy, which they include. They know who they are and what they want to be themselves, these human beings. And under ideal circumstances, they can live peacefully by themselves. For these liberal, social configurations are a matter of convenience only. They are thought through on the model of purposeful, voluntary associations. Yeah, seen from that light, politics is just kind of an add-on. It's something you can have or not have, and you still see this in prominent utterances such as Margaret Thatcher's when she said, quote, and there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and their families, and this was it for her. But also we see the influence of this liberal model, for example, in the way in which we think about rewards and punishments. Now, 20th century scholarship across many disciplines has thrown serious doubts onto this liberal understanding of what human beings are. There are first evolutionary studies of human beings and various kinds of disciplines who have shown us time and again in various configurations how brain, language, culture, and sociality have co-evolved with each other, forming a species that is deeply dependent in all of its aspects on cooperations with others. Cultural humanists and the soft social sciences and the humanities have shown us that human beings can only understand themselves in the world with the help of cultural forms which they borrow and adapt from others. These cultural forms basically replace in this understandings of what instincts do for animals. They give us an immense flexibility to adjust ourselves to various kinds of circumstances, and are certainly part of the success of the species human being. Cultural forms are ways of knowing, ways of feeling, ways of sensing, ways of acting that generate understandings. And these are, of course, historically and situationally highly contingent. Understandings underpin the ability of human beings to act in the world. Precisely because we have no instincts, we need these understandings who come and that we get from other human beings. Also, learning is the capacity to form stable understandings. As agency is also dependent that we have stable understandings. Conclusion of all of this research is that human life is life in constitutive, ongoing cooperations with others. So it means we cannot do without others, even in the way that we form our understanding of the world. And this shows in so many ways, for example, in pathologies of the public sphere today. So understandings, and with it agency and learning, are stabilized in validating events, because we need to understand now how we get from a minute understanding in some context into more durable forms of understanding. And there are three different types of such events that can validate our understandings. The first is recognition through the approval of other human beings. That's the reason why I've put these thumbs up, the likes on the right-hand side. Through corroboration, that's the second form through which understandings can be validated. They're corroborated when we are successful in action. And then we have resonance that assesses the fit of understandings that we have with those understandings we already have in place. Let me just make two quick examples to show you what this means. Learning how to ride a bike. Recognition is, for example, the parental encouragement. You're doing great, honey. Corroboration is the kid's feeling that, oh, I can balance. This is wonderful. So not verbally, but really physically in the body. Resonance is, oh, I had learned this already on a strider before, on a stroller thing. So you just go with one foot. That's sort of how an understanding that a child can bike really comes about, at the intersection of these three different sorts of events. Now, you take something else, when you want to evaluate governance. Recognition is, well, we are governed well. So it's the utterance of somebody who you trust, an authority. Corroboration is that you have an issue and it is resolved by the government. For example, they have done well in organizing vaccination campaigns. And resonance is, well, from your education and have sort of believed for a long time that government is good or bad, and sort of thereby resonates with this understanding that it is good or bad. You see that in complex understandings, usually recognition plays an outsized role because you have very little leeway of corroborating things, right? And this is very important to note whenever you raise questions of justice, for example, questions of the goodness of governance at that level, recognition is almost always all there is. So let me go to the second point of what are institutions. There are, for us sociologists, every form of regularized pattern of interactions. So they're extremely varied in scope and in temporal scale. Regular greetings across the fence are institutions, right? So if you're just doing it every morning as you're leaving the house, greeting your neighbor, waving or shaking hands, that is an institution. Thanksgiving dinner is an institution in two ways. The one that you celebrate at home is institutionalized in your family, but then it's an institution in larger societies, which reminds you that this is something that you ought to do. The Federal Reserve Bank system is an institution. The English language is an institution. The papacy is an institution, and so on and so forth. They go from very small scale to very, very large scale. Now, the thing is, and this is my important point here, that personal understandings are institutions precisely to the degree that they become stable. It means any understanding that you have of the world, for example, about politics, is contingent on these validating events that you are subjected to. Now, institutions are then constituted within networks and hierarchies of other institutions. There's no such thing as an institution coming along. So institutions are supported by infrastructural institutions. Think about how language as an institution or calendars, synchronized timekeeping, traffic, power, and communication infrastructures maintain a wide range of institutions. No organization could live without any of those. Understandings are institutions constituted by stable social arrangements. Validation, comes forth from a parent in a regular way, good or bad, comes forth from a teacher in a regular way, good or bad. We are all in need for these regular, recurring events of validation to maintain a stable understanding of the world. So that is important for us. So what this means, and this might sound strange at first, is that literally every human being is an institution. You are who you are. You think the way you think, you feel the way you sense, and how you translate this sensing and this feeling and this thinking into understanding. That's what you are. Understandings are the interface through which you exist in the world. That really means you are deeply dependent on the world. Rather than being this Vitruvian man, so that I had at the very beginning, you're pretty much a patchwork of different sorts of things that I'm trying to symbolize here with this beautiful painting by Arcimboldo. You resemble that much more. And in order to keep that face together how you are, you need constant input from other sides. So also when you want to change yourself, you might need to have to change the environment in which you interact, right? Often change is not possible sort of within the kinds of institutional frameworks that give you certain kinds of recognitions, but withhold other kinds of recognitions from you. So the conclusions of this thinking is that you exist as you are only through reliable relations to sources of recognition, corroboration, and resonance. This is essential, and I think it helps us a lot to understand what's going on. Now, politics, here comes another definition, so that is different from most of the ones that you probably have learned at one point in time. Politics is the art to form, maintain, or alter institutions. That's the core of it, which really means that politics happens at very small scales. I mean, if you want to change Thanksgiving dinner rituals in your family, you do that at that scale, and that's politics, right? You have to talk to people, you have to make proposals, you have to argue with them through this and sort of see where you get with. That's politics, just as much as it is politics what we see and call usually politics at the local, at the regional, or at the national level. Now, since institutions are maintained in interaction with others, everybody who wants to form, maintain, or alter an institution needs to persuade, convince, or control other human beings to adjust their behavior to come along. So therefore, successful politics requires occasions and venues for mobilizing people. It requires techniques of addressing others successfully, and that's what rhetoric does, and this is the reason why Parrhesia here is on board today. And behavioral changes only come about by changing the understandings of people, the way they think, feel, and perceive the world. So politics also requires fora and forms of interaction in which understandings can be formed and transformed, right? No politics would ever take place sort of without this change of understanding. Now, another aspect that is crucial for politics is that it depends on imaginaries. Imaginaries are methods to produce images of the otherwise, right? Utopias produce images of better worlds, inspiring efforts to form and transform extant institutions. It's again easy to see how utopias go all the way down, into the family. So where you have ideals of what good family life could be like, or you have ideals what a good Thanksgiving dinner looks like whenever yours is going wrong all the time, right? And then you can sort of try to undertake steps in that direction. Dystopias, by contrast, are images of the world as it is far worse than the one that we see before ourselves, and they animate politics of a maintenance. It means mostly reformists work with utopias, as Karl Mannheim had already pointed out, and conservatives work with dystopias. It could be always worse, and that's the reason why we need to maintain things as they are. But these images, and they are emotion laden, there's emotional understandings that are saturating these images, are very, very important. So participation as the next step here in politics matters most where institutions are inescapable, right? So here a scene, sort of migrants scaling the US border as of between Mexico and California. So there are basically, and Albert Hirschman is sort of the author of these concepts, three ways of relating to the institutional framework in which you exist. So A, you can say it's insufferable. I do not see any possibility for changing it, and so therefore I leave it. That's the exit strategy. And that's what we do a great lot in our everyday lives, right? So, family life becomes suffocating. The life in your village becomes suffocating. It does not allow you who you want to be. So you move to the big city. You just look for a different circle of friends. You go to college, you get inspired in new ways. Voice means you see a possibility to change the institutional environments in which you live. And you will make an effort to do so precisely because you see a possibility that politics can work. And loyalty basically means you have no issue with how the institutional arrangements work at the moment. You're quite happy where you are. So that means politics becomes important for those people who do not want to exit or cannot exit for whatever reason and want to stay here and sort of, have an influence, on the institutions within which they live and through which they live, on whom they are dependent for a particular form of their own life. Now, what's the role of public spheres within this? Public spheres are enduring spaces, institutionalized, that means, in which political work takes place openly. The opposite of public spheres are hidden spheres, in which political work takes place, so-called and smoke-filled back rooms, sort of here as on the image that I put on this slide. Contrary to general linguistic use in the United States, there is not the public sphere, but there are many overlapping and nesting public spheres, partly tracking institutional architectonics. There's a public in your family, there's a public in the village, there's a public of sorts in many different kinds, even in the city and so on. Some are specific to a handful of small-scale institutions, others are local, national, or even international in scope. So, public spheres and hidden spheres are organized, and that's also very important, in particular ways. They all have membership rules. None of the publics that we know welcome everybody. There's always thresholds of some kind. And even where there are no thresholds or low thresholds, there's often a division of labor, so that leads to participation rules, where there are some people who, are allowed to do a lot of the creative work, and other people are more followers. So where there are active political rules and passive political roles to take within public spheres. Then there are rules of thematizations. There are certain kinds of things in these public spheres that you can say, and then there are other things that you cannot say. There are rules of form, so style, in terms of how things can be talked about. There's no public sphere where this is not the case. Then there are epistemic rules. What is it that counts in this particular sphere as an argument? What is it that counts as evidence? What is it that counts as truth? And what is it that is validated within this public sphere and what is not? That means what sort of institutions can be maintained or changed within this, or how can you within this public sphere look for allies to become politically active in the one way or the other. All of these public spheres have linkages to hidden spheres. There is a kind of a competition between both worlds, and there's a complementarity, because there are certain things that you can do in public that you cannot want to do, or where the hidden is not particularly effective, and vice versa, where you can do things in hidden spheres, backroom politics, that you do not want to, for whatever reason, or you can't do in the public sphere. So there's a dialectic between most of those whenever you look at concrete institutional kinds of arrangements. They're linked, these spheres, with each other, and to look at the architectonics is very important. There is always a mediating technology. It's just viva voce, or is this, through technology as we are doing it today. And these technologies all have particular sorts of affordances of what you can do in the sphere and what you cannot do, how you can mobilize others, how you can be rhetorically effective, and so on and so forth. All of these need to be taken into account. And the question is then always, with any sphere, are they an organization? That means, are they organized by somebody who controls all of those rules? Or are these institutions that have bubbled up, sort of in everyday interactions? So here on the right-hand side, I have a classroom teacher poster with rules about interaction in the classroom. And if we had time, it would be interesting to see how contradictory they are. And most public spheres have contradictory rules of this kind. So public and hidden spheres are complements, and they compete with each other in all political tasks. And I don't want to go through this table step by step because it would take too much time and sort of too many qualifications. But I want to sort of point out again, what is important is that within them, imaginaries are developed. Problems are articulated. Action alternatives are formulated. Knowledge is produced, is curated, and is distributed and validated. Mobilization of others for action is done. Agreement has to be achieved within these, and buy-in, that means the degree to which I actually I'm personally committed to particular agreements that are made within the sphere. And both public and hidden spheres have very different qualities in this regard. And sort of how they work out in each case depends very much on how they are organized. So the crucial question for a democratic public sphere is then this. First, you have to ask yourself, is the good life in supportive institutions only obtainable by exit or also by voice? Right? When voice, then the public sphere is important. So the one that admits you in the one way or the other in whatever role. And then the question really is, how and to which degree do people living through particular institutional arrangements have access to politics forming, maintaining, and changing these institutions, right? They make you these institutions, and the question is, can you participate in this making? And this is, again, true at all levels: family, school, work, club, city, region, nation, world. And you, wherever you are with these institutional arrangements, want to ask this question. So then the crucial question is also, to which degree is the actual influence on politics, that means on institution making, on institutional change, equal? Or in proportion to the impact that these institutions have on questions that are of concern to you? So, and finally, sort of questions to ponder then in public spheres. Here again, examples on the right-hand side, the old media, the new media, but also the family dinner table. How, through what precise features of its organization, does any particular public sphere enhance or diminish political influence over what kinds of institutions? For whom? Who controls the organization of the rules in these public spheres? How is this control exercised? And what influence does it have for the possibilities of to participate in politics? That matters. And with this, I want to close just pointing out one last time, in thinking through all of this, you have to think about Arcimboldo. You have to just be aware of the fact that you are fundamentally social and you are dependent on others, and the institutions that you form together with them, they make you who you are. And it makes a huge difference whether you can participate in changing these, alternating these, or whether you cannot. And publics are one of the main venues through which you can do this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andreas. I'll turn it over to you, Genevieve.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for that. So I'm going to pick up from some of what Andreas was talking about, but I am going to be speaking in a somewhat more, I guess, idealist vein rather than descriptive, maybe more normative, because I'm going to talk about the idea or the ideology of the democratic public in notions of democracy. And I think in our contemporary society, why do we think that, although Andreas is completely right that there is no one unified public sphere, mass public sphere, and although public forms of interaction, public institutions are only one among many that organize and govern our collective life, I do think that the idea of the democratic public sphere has unusual or distinctive importance in democratic ideology, maybe in democratic aspirations, and in my own thinking about myself as a political and social being in this world, which is that the democratic public sphere is understood, and I think has been understood for a long time, as the central site through which the democratic public constitutes itself as such. Right? The democratic public sphere, when we are addressing each other as members of the public rather than as intimates who we know through our relations of family or school or religion or whatever it may be, we address each other as shared participants in this imagined thing, the nation state, the country. And so, and also the democratic public sphere, this address among non-intimates, is one of the primary ways through which democratic politics occurs. It's one of the places, it's an incredibly important and rich site through which the project of collective self-government happens. Now, of course, it's not the only site. The family, the church, the school are also all the sort of these spaces of quasi-private, in distinction to the public, are all really important as well. The democratic public is one of the spaces in which, and has always been understood in contrast to the private, as a site of certain kinds of freedom, right? When you are participating in the public, you are not chained by the particularity, the constraints of the whatever, religious, social, family networks that limit you. And, you know, if we can, so much popular art from the, say, the last 2 or 3 centuries talks about the freedom that comes from being part of a community that constitutes itself, and that is understood in distinction to the much richer, but also maybe more constraining social relations that are the family and the religion, etc. My favorite song in recent weeks for thinking about this is Radio Gaga. I don't know if anyone knows it, the amazing Queen song, in which Freddie Mercury sings about being a kid, having no friends, and he turns on the radio, and this is the one place he's at home. And all he needs to hear is Radio Gaga. And then, right, and then this becomes this incredibly popular song, and he sings it to thousands of people, all of whom are participating in this collective remembrance of their own isolation and then coming together, not because they're intimates, but because they're strangers, coming together through the forms of their strangerhood. And I cherish the publicness. I cherish the mass public because of these forms of liberation, and because it's hard for me to imagine forms of democratic self-government that do not organize themselves around a notion of the public, this idea of the person in distinction to the private being. Now, and also I just think as a descriptive matter, when thinking about politics in America, this idea of a democratic public sphere is incredibly important to thinking, to our aspirations, to how we think politics should happen. But it's also right now, as this event I think signals, it's an ideal that creates great angst and soul searching, because there seem to be all kinds of problems with the democratic public sphere, which we're going to ask you to reflect upon more. And I think it's an important and not obvious. The answer to this is not obvious at all to me, but it's an important question to ask when thinking about the problems with the democratic public sphere, which is, are these problems new? Or are they entirely new? Or have we never really had a democratic public sphere of the kind that we would want to have if we are really committed to a project of democratic self-government? When commentators talk about a lot of the contemporary problems, when we think about the problems with social media, say, and the deplatforming of Trump, or the violence on social media, there is often a tendency to describe these problems as a novel consequence of the new technological affordances of these new social spaces. I am skeptical of that, because we have had, there are deep problems with the democratic public sphere, with the inclusiveness of the democratic public sphere, with the kinds of equality values that Andreas was talking about, and with the extent to which the democratic public sphere is really open and self-constitutive in this way. But we can nevertheless think that these problems are, although long-standing, have been particularly altered by the particular technological and political circumstances in which we find ourselves. So I just thought, I'm in a law school, I always like to break things down into categories and give you suggestions on what to think about. So I think we can identify 3 buckets of problems with how the democratic public sphere that we've had and have today operates, that pose a challenge to the ideal of the democratic public sphere as the site in which the public, the people, the citizens, whoever we think are the people who should populate this thing called the public sphere, can participate and decide collectively on the conditions under which they will operate, right? That's the great vision of democracy. It's an incredibly difficult, crazy, idealistic idea of how society operates, but that's the vision. And I think there are 3 problems. Okay, so one, and this is the problem that the area of law, constitutional law that I focus on, the First Amendment, has traditionally focused on the most, and that is government control, right? The point of a democratic society is that the people tell the government what to do. They decide all the difficult and unresolved normative questions that divide politics and society in all kinds of ways. And yet, of course, the operation of society depends upon the government in the modern state maintaining something like I don't think I can say a monopoly, but because the government allows private violence in all kinds of ways, but strong control over the legitimate means of violence and tremendous economic and political power of all sorts. And this gives the government the ability through laws and other forms of soft sanctions to limit what can be said in the democratic public. And this, I'm not telling you anything new. Anyone who grows up in America today has heard tons about the threat to the vibrancy of the democratic public by government censorship, but I don't think we should take it seriously. I think what the last 4 years have shown us is a government that hates dissent and hates difference of opinion can exercise quite powerful constraints on it. And so that's one very serious problem that no one wants to discount. I certainly don't. There is another problem, though. It's not just government control. That's the one we're familiar with, where we know to worry about that. There's another very serious problem that has always been, or that has been a problem to the democratic organization of the public sphere in America since the mid-19th century, and this is private property. So although when the country was founded, the government happened to own and control the most important mechanism for mass communication, for public communication in the country, which was the post office. And from the beginning, the government imposed on itself not strong non-discrimination obligations with respect to the post office in the name of this thing called the democratic public. The language was a little bit different, but the idea was we want to allow the people to decide for themselves what they will hear and say. By the mid-19th century, when the telegraph is developed, Robert Morse, its creator, comes of age in a period when he assumed that the government would run the telegraph, because it would be crazy to give to private property owners the ability to control the channels of communication to the democratic public. I mean, who would think of such a thing? And so he tries to give his technology to the government, but the federal government is about to enter civil war, is not interested. And after it tries to run a government telegraph line between DC and Baltimore and it fails, it just never tries again, gives it to the private sector. And we get our first mega monopoly in this country, Western Union, which becomes gets into close partnership with the Associated Press. And this is called the telegraph news monopoly or the two-headed monopoly. And it is understood as a tremendous threat to the independence of the press because, among other things, well, Western Union won't allow union telegraphs to go through its mail when it's opposed to the interests of the union laborers, but also won't allow newspapers that criticize either Western Union or the AP to use its wires. And since it controls 90% of the telegraph wires in the country, this is a huge problem. So from the 1850s, we've been grappling with the tremendous threats posed to the openness and independence of the democratic public sphere, as it's supposed to be, right, the site of self-constitution. But if the private actors that are owning those sites in which this self-constitution occurs are exercising control over what can be said, it suggests that the private property owners, in fact, who are controlling the democratic public. And of course, you know, I'm talking about the telegraph wires, but the same problem emerged in the early 20th century with the telephones, and then with radio, and then with television. and now with the social media platforms. The problem we have right now is not new. Since the 1850s, virtually every important forum of mass communication in the United States has been privately owned and privately regulated. And so it's not a new problem, but it is a very profound problem. And it raises all kinds of questions about how we should think about private property rights when it comes to the mass public sphere. And then there is a third set of problems, and they're sort of interacting with each other. You can see it's not simple to think about what to do, because of course you could say, well, the government could constrain the power of the private property owners, but this is now expanding the possibility of government censorship. And so right now, when we think about social media platforms, we could say, well, the social media companies have too much power, which I think they do, right? They get to determine who can speak on these incredibly important and vibrant sites of mass public expression. But so let's give the government the right to tell Twitter and Facebook who can speak and who cannot. But we just had President Trump as our president in control of the apparatus, the federal government, where we really have wanted the federal government telling the social media platforms who they can allow in and who they cannot. And so there is an extent to which we've got two titans, and we should recognize both. Private power and government power are both very serious problems, very serious threats to this beautiful idea of democratic self-constitution. But it's not, it's keeping both in mind and then thinking about regulatory solutions, it's not easy. And then there is a third set of problems with this beautiful idea of the democratic public. And this is something Andreas referred to. And this is society, private society, right? That's a problem. Because of course, society is not just a space for exchange and collaboration and conversation and persuasion. It's also a site for intimidation, for violence, for the exercise of power, for deception, for embarrassment, for causing all kinds of psychological harm, for reinforcing inequalities, both political, economic, and social, for misogyny, for racism, for all these terrible things. They are reproduced. The public sphere in some ways seems like an escape from the provincial horizons of the private, right? That's why we turn to it. That's what Freddie Mercury was saying. Radio Gaga, right? It's a space where being a queer boy in England in 1960s, suddenly you have freedom. But of course, it's not, there is no escape from society. Every human institution is going to be organized in ways, is going to be informed by the society that it is helping to structure and is structured by. And so when we think about, say, gender in the mass public, we might think, well, actually, maybe we want to give the government the ability to limit speech on the platforms. And maybe we want to give the private property owners the right to limit speech when it is harassing speech or racist speech or intimidating speech or insurrectionist speech, right? But who gets to decide that? Who gets to distinguish between what's the permitted speech and what's the not permitted speech? And how does that interact with this idea that the democratic public gets to self-constitute itself? Those are three problems that I think we've had with the democratic public sphere from the beginning, but especially since the 1850s, when this massive change occurred in the organization of our political society, and we started to depend upon private property owners to serve as the vanguard, the governors of this core democratic institution, the mass public sphere. To some degree, they have been lessened by new technologies. I don't mean to suggest that technology doesn't have any effect on any of these problems. We're here to talk about the problems with the democratic public sphere today. I also want to celebrate its virtues, right? What technology has afforded is it has, and this has been an ongoing process, but we have slowly lowered the barriers to entry to mass public speech. It is much, much easier than it has ever been for people to participate actively as speakers, as listeners, as active agents without having to satisfy gatekeepers' wishes or desires, or without having to be of a certain stature or of a certain class in the mass public. We have a much more democratic public sphere than we've ever had before, and that's amazing. And so in some ways that does lessen some of the pressure, right? The private property owners who are governing the mass public spheres have a tremendous amount of power. On the other hand, we are now accustomed to being able to speak our piece on the platforms if we so wish. And so there is already, I think, a whole set of social norms and expectations that are going to limit, as a social matter, if not as a legal matter, the ability of the private property owners or the government to limit the entrance, say, or content of the mass public. And we might think that's a good thing. On the other hand, the current political environment, or the last the sort of last few years of politics, last few decades of politics have in some ways intensified these problems that are longstanding, because since the 1970s, the government has been committed to deregulation when it comes to the regulation of media. And the result has been to give the private property owners who control these mass publics both a lot more power to just make decisions without any democratic input about the property they own. And it has also led to increasing concentration of control. So we have, on the one hand, a much more democratic public sphere in which lots of people can participate. On the other hand, we have a whole body of social institutions that are governed, organized, and owned by relatively few people. And so the tensions between the democratic ideal, right, and the capitalist reality of our society are pretty profound right now. I mean, I think that's incredibly generative. I think we are asking, this is pushing us to ask really deep questions about how we organize our mass public sphere. But there are difficult questions in part because the presumption, certainly in my neck of the woods, in free speech land, is that the way in which we preserve sort of freedom is to preserve the property rights of the owners of the platforms, the media companies, the newspaper industry. And so the question is that wrong? Do we need to think about another way of regulating public speech? So that's my 2 cents. I guess I'll close by saying I'm really curious to hear what all of you have to say. I think this is a really exciting time to be thinking about democracy and its potential, in part because it is a time of great extremes. On the one hand, we have a lot of democratic possibility. Things seem very generative in some respects. On the other hand, it's inescapable, the very deep, deep problems with our democratic society. I'll stop.
Thanks to both of you, gave us lots to think about. I think in the interest of the time we have left, maybe we can see this piece as a public, right? And we could engage in the discussion about that. Genevieve, I'm going to turn it back to you and Andreas first. For those of you in the public, feel free to raise your hand or put a question in chat and we'll bring it around to you. But I want to throw back that last question, Genevieve, to you and Andreas and to the group that we have in front of us. But, you know, what are the other ways that we could be organizing the public sphere? What are the options that are out there? And Genevieve, I'll start with you, and then Andreas, I'll tag you in, and then the rest of you, you're tagged in with that prompt or with any other questions you have.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so if we really are committed to a democratic public sphere in which there is something like democratic control over the means of mass communication or the spaces of mass communication, there are a ton of options that are available. They're all kind of revolutionary right now, honestly. It's not, the options are not easy. There are easy things we could do, but that would, there are band-aids we could put on the problem. And then there are deep and I think ambitious proposals out there on the table to think more deeply about the sort of that are would more fundamentally alter the operation of the democratic public sphere. So one option is to return government control, to limit the role that private property owners play. And there are efforts underway right now to try and come up with a government-owned social media platform. Ethan Zuckerberg, who used to run the MIT Media Lab, is working on this right now as an alternative. It's like a public option, right? Maybe we cannot get rid of the private insurers, but we can have a public option that is going to be better in all kinds of ways. And slowly we're gonna, through the magic of the market, we're gonna move people to that. So that's one idea. We fund a democratic social media company. Another is, you know, and I haven't even talked about the problem. I mean, neither Andreas or I have talked about the problem posed by the death of journalism, but it's a very serious problem because, of course, one of the ways in which historically we have mediated the tensions between, on the one hand, wanting a lot of participation, and then on the other hand, recognizing that an extremely democratic public sphere raises all kinds of problems for truth-seeking and for sort of adjudicating between competing voices. The way in which we've historically done that is through the journalists, right? The profession of journalists who have, on the one hand, played a really, I don't know, Noam Chomsky would say really destructive gatekeeping role in like determining what the sphere of proper discourse is, but at least given the highly concentrated nature of our newspaper markets in this country, which is something we can also talk about. On the other hand, they have historically played this incredibly important role in organizing and structuring the public sphere. And so there are suggestions to try and think about reinvigorating journalism by either providing massive public subsidies to journalists, which would sort of change the character of public discourse, or by, although this is really complicated, by doing some kind of tax regulation where you drain off some of the profits that the social media platforms are getting from the diversion of advertising to them, to journalists. I think we should really be thinking about how we can create kind of democratic spaces for public discourse that are not centrally controlled, because I do worry about government censorship, but that are really subject to democratic control and democratic oversight, so that the government sets in place a regulatory scheme for how these spaces operate, but doesn't dictate what can and cannot be said in these spaces. That would be my ideal option. But it's hard right now to imagine. It's just so hard to imagine anything like that happening. But at a small scale level, I do think, it is worthwhile and really interesting to think about the spaces, to think about experimenting with more democratic forms of control and regulation of the public spheres. I think it's worth thinking about at this university, and then maybe more at broader spaces, at broader scales.
I mean, so you have already sort of put the lay of the land so out very nicely, Genevieve. So what I would like to add is the following. First of all, there's a little bit of a problem of thinking in terms of society here, public sphere as a mediating space, and government there. So to me as a sociologist, this does not make very much sense, because if everybody who is in government is in society as well, and so they're in the middle of in the public sphere as well, there's a lot of interaction there that are done by the same players. Just look at Trump, right? So he uses what's called the public sphere as a government sort of an instrument. I mean, it's very interesting, right? So this is how this is done. Government by Twitter, basically bypassing the usual processes of bureaucracies and so on and so forth. So the government doesn't necessarily need to be your enemy as long as the government is a democratically constituted government. The problem that we have here in this country, in many other Western democracies, is that the government is not a democratically constituted government and is captured in the United States by capital, who basically owns it and has owned it for a very long period of time. So it's about a small, we're living basically in an oligarchy. So it's actually not even the contrast between government versus private industry, but they are also very closely intertwined with each other, right? So we cannot possibly separate them so easily. So that's just a methodological kind of an issue in the way we want to think about this. The second thing is, I very much agree with you that the public option is something that can be done. There are many countries around the world that have run small-scale experiments, for example, with random seminars, polling citizens randomly, sort of putting them into seminar kind of situations over a weekend and letting them talk things out about public things and giving them certain control. For example, the German-speaking part of Belgium, Eupen-Malmedy in the far east of Belgium, they're running a good deal of what is now done governmentally, so through a citizen board like this. So there are other places where whole city budgets are actually administered in that way through citizen boards. By creating these publics, really, that work, from within. They can be constituted by law, and the track record that we have on a global scale is actually very good. This is just a question: do we want this or do we not want this? There are other proposals on the table by James Fishkin and others, political scientists, to have such a thing as democracy day. Just let's imagine our whole electoral process would be very different by just the last weekend, before the election or a week before the election. We are all assembling in these small groups and we're all discussing the major issues of this election with each other. A gigantic rollout of the whole country. It's certainly not more expensive than the electoral campaigns that we're running at the moment are. Not at all. So, yes, maybe revolutionary, but the question is one of overcoming obstacles. You have to ask the question, who has an interest of preventing something of that to happen? And these are probably the people who own the government anyway at the moment, right? So we just have to name exactly where the resistance to an invigorated or a different public sphere comes about. And it's not just a question, I'm very much on board with you there at the end. It's not just a question of who speaks or who's allowed to speak, but it's the modalities of speaking that could be regulated. So the big problem with the public media platforms are the algorithms. Before anybody is just admitted or not admitted, it's the problem of amplification. So, so all hate speech would matter a lot less if the algorithms by which these platforms operate would not automatically amplify outrage within, and actually sort of have a dynamic, create a dynamic that is driven entirely by profit motives to make people more and more outraged about anything in the world. There's absolutely no reason not to regulate this through. I mean, with the chances of getting this through under the current situation in the United States, that's a different story, right? But in principle, this can be doable. This is not difficult.
Can I just add one thing? Because that was all very interesting. And I guess I'll just say, I didn't mean to suggest that the government is not in society, but in democratic ideology, right? Because I agree with you, the government is as in society as everything else that's in society is in society. And, one of the and so I'm a little bit more worried about government power than you are, precisely because I think the government is in society, and we know that one of the most important tools of democratic politics is the tool of publicity, right? Precisely because we are depending upon people voting for you or liking you, whatever, being able to get your voice out is incredibly important and powerful. And so that is why even when we have a more robust democratic, and I agree with you though, we have a very terrible democracy. So if we could improve, I mean, we could solve a lot of these problems, not by thinking or working on the democratic public sphere directly at all, just by improving the quality, the nature of our representative democracy. So the formal processes for sure. But even if we got rid of the, I think scandalous malapportionment in the Senate and the sort of very powerful democratic failures with the existing system, I still think the entrenched power, the entrenched political elite would still have an interest in limiting the voices of those who are opposed to them, precisely because, not necessarily because they think, they would say things like that's such bad speech or whatever. They maybe don't think anything like that, but because it's a powerful political tool. And so there is this tension. I think this tension between the way democratic politics operates, which is organized heavily around the power of publicity, and the idea that we want to have an expansive public sphere in which the people get to, people can participate. And then on the other hand, I guess this is just one more thing, which is your remarks made me wonder, who is against this idea of a public option, or who is against the idea of the reforms to the algorithms, which I have to say, I agree. Of all the reforms we can make to social media platforms, this is the most exciting to me, although difficult, there's a lot of things to think about it, but limiting the ability of the platforms or to amplify speech, I think would do a lot to alter the character of the speech on social media, which is in part fragmented and polarizing because it's intended to fragment and polarize, because that's how the platforms make a buck. But thinking about that, and I was just agreeing with you, it also made me wonder, so I'm saying that there's tension between democratic publicity and the democratic ideal of the public sphere, sort of inherent. So democracy is pushing in two different directions here. But we might also think that there is a deep tension between capitalism and the notion of the democratic public sphere. And certainly the history of this country suggests as much, that the profit mode, the commercial nature of the entities that control the public sphere dictates the desire to make profit is so important to dictating their decision making, and is likely to produce tremendous amount of resistance to change. It does suggest a deep tension between capitalism, the free market, and the marketplace of ideas, or the public sphere, because of course the social media companies would fight tooth and nail against any regulatory reform that limited their ability to amplify speech, because that's how they get the eyeballs and that's how they sell advertising. It's all organized around a profit motive.
I think we should take our audience in. So, there are
yes
in the chat several.
Yeah, David actually has a question, I think, that gets at that, two different historic ways that we have regulated the public sphere with media. David, can I call on you to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. It's a great discussion. This whole issue of how do we regulate the social media platforms is just incredibly important. And when a majority, not majority, but a significant minority of the population believes that that Joe Biden lost the election, we've got a serious problem that we're facing. But I wonder what we have learned from historic efforts to control media, if you will. On the private side, we had the Motion Picture Production Code that was done by Hollywood, a private effort to control decency in motion pictures. And then also in the 30s, we had the FCC that established control through licensing over radio and television stations, and also had decency standards. But if you look at the history of that, it seems that most of those standards were done on the private side by the owners of TV stations or radio stations, and not so much the FCC. But it was the FCC was a government control mechanism. So what have we learned from those kinds of things historically that might be applicable to what we do about regulating social media?
Can I jump in on this?
More you evaluate.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think history has a whole series of lessons what not to do rather than lessons what to do. Although there are some lessons of what to do. I mean, I think the early history of public broadcasting in this country, for example, is really interesting. Both the Corporation of Public Broadcasting in its early days, there was, did really pretty amazing civil rights work in the 60s and 70s before it started to shy away from more controversial issues. And so there are some good stories, but the code, the production code from the 30s, it seems like a very good example. And similarly, the very stringent constraints on what the radio broadcasters would broadcast that was imposed by the National Association of Broadcasters, which was the industry group that represented the 500 largest radio broadcasters in the country around the same time as the code. Both of these were instituted. I mean, there was a concern about government regulation. It was a little bit like Facebook now saying we're going to create a quasi-judicial oversight board in an effort to avoid government regulation. But with the movies, I think by that time they already knew that it was going to be hard going on First Amendment grounds for there to be an aggressive censorship regime. And certainly by the 50s, when we've got the production code in full gear, there's no longer any possibility that the government could regulate. So what the movie companies are doing is it's profit motive. They do not want to have charges. They don't want to face negative publicity that they're seducing the nation's young or that they're ungodly or whatever. And so they self-regulate and impose very strict constraints on what can be said. Now, I think right now we're in a moment where people really want there to be more censorship because we are aware of the dangers of speech. And so perhaps that all sounds great. Like and that's what the platforms are promising, that they're going to censor a lot more. But the history of self-regulation is a history of, it's not that the corporations were thinking deeply about what's speech that is too dangerous to society. What, for example, the radio broadcasters would not allow in the air was any information about the movement for birth control, the feminist movement for birth control, which they thought was just too controversial. And the feminist pioneers who were arguing that women's control over birth control is really important to their equality, they got a cold shoulder. And the reason was because the radio companies didn't want to lose advertisers who thought this was anti-family, right? Anti-patriarchy, which obviously it was. Also, total blackout of union advertising. In the 20s, the unions think, oh, wow, this new democratic medium of the radio is going to be our shot. We're going to be able to reach so many people with our labor messages. And what happens afterwards is a total blackout, almost total blackout on union voices on the radios. That is not government imposed, it's self-regulation. Mm-hmm. And so all of this suggests that we should, first of all, not think that self-regulation is necessarily a less censorial alternative to government regulation. I think it is sometimes suggested, the companies are not going to be as bad as the government, but I think in many cases it's going to be much more censorial because the companies have a concerted interest in not appearing communist or partisan or anti-family or whatever it may be. And second, that self-regulation is ultimately going to be guided by profit motives rather than by democratic interests. And so even when it aligns, like I think the decision to deplatform Trump was the correct decision. And I'm happy the platforms did it. I think it's more complicated. Should he always lose his ability to participate in platforms? But certainly for now, yes, I think completely right. But that doesn't make me any less skeptical of the decision-making, the quality of the decision-making or the motives that are informing the decision-making of the platforms, even though in some instances I may agree with the outcomes.
Peter, can I call on you for your question?
Yes, yeah, I can expand a little on what I said in the general chat, which is participation in these public spheres does require labor and it requires time. And even if we're envisioning, a beautiful place where everyone can freely enter in and discuss, and we do have these multiple publics that are addressing different topics, there are social media platforms that are a bit more democratically focused, such as, subreddits or Facebook pages where people moderate themselves and they work towards community standards. But within these spaces, there are people who have influence, who have perhaps undue influence through an exceptional amount of time or an exceptional amount of money, or they're able to just generate more. So there's always going to be this imbalanced kind of playing field. These discursive spaces will always have powerful figures who emerge. Even in a public option of a social media platform, I can imagine that this would quickly happen. And this will leave people who don't have the time or money or privilege or what have you to participate in the public sphere. And again, we see the undue influence perhaps of these small self-governing communities that start to spread. A platform like Reddit, I think, is a great example of this, where one subreddit like the Donald wielded a great amount of influence on Donald Trump's electoral campaign, but it was a small group of moderators who were trying to maintain a little democracy. So thoughts on how to address this power, the fields of power that come up, that emerge.
Yeah, there's also something to be done about the internal dynamics of the self-regulation. So you could also make rules about that, right? First of all, the ideal is, of course, that we all have enough time and enough commitment to participate sort of in the public sphere in as far as the important institutions and their maintenance is concerned, right? That's the reason why the ancient Greeks thought that you need to have leisure in order to really be a citizen, right? So, ideally, we got to have something along these lines, and ideally, this is what minimum income also was supposed to enable people to do. We have to think about, of splitting up our time in a different way moving forward between, work and career and family, and actually more apportioning time, for all sort of in this direction. So we have to really think about this, and this discussion hasn't even started. You're absolutely right on the money with this. We have to think about this. And internally, I think it's a question of, again, how to organize sort of these discussions groups on Reddits, for example. Sort of a minimum way of doing this is just to limit how often you can say something, right? Sort of, or, how many characters you can write or something like this, and just begin to see how far you get with regulations of that sort, so that you are more inclusive, just like in a seminar room, right? Sort of where you also just have to make sure that it's not the same 3 or 4 students who speak all the time, right? So it's a matter of managing this, sort of making it more inclusive and letting other people talk. But that's a great point. It happens everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to more questions, but Andreas, your answers also make me wonder. I mean, this is a great question. It's really worth thinking. And I do like the example of Reddit and the Donald, which I think is a fascinating answer. And I think it raises really deep questions about democratic theory, right? Because there is a way in which, well, first of all, how much participation do we think is normatively desirable of citizens in society? Even, do we want to? Is the Greek model a great? Is a great model? Because of course, one of the preconditions of leisure was that other people are doing work, the citizens, and that's not great. I think.
Yeah, but we're living in very different times. People have shown time and again, work plays a very different sort of role today. And we have different possibilities with the kind of productive capabilities that we have. One sort of can think more openly and revolutionary about these.
Yeah, but then also
the Greeks were very aware of this paradox as Peter is articulating it. So in the end, they could only help themselves with ostracism, right? Those people who just are too noisy, and too much in it, and sort of have too much influence, they're getting thrown out, right? Very simple. I mean, so, it's kind of a problematic solution, of course, even from a democratic theory perspective. But it shows of how much they were actually aware of this problem already of undue influence, and how undue influence sort of has a way of it's a public good in the sense that it becomes bigger. It has increasing returns to scale, right? Influence, and that's the problem there.
Well, but that goes to this, I think, question, which is, what do we think, what is undue influence? Because, I mean, of course, democracy is a is an idea that we all think of as really positive. It's great. Who doesn't like democracy? But if we really think that what democracy means is that the society, the people who make up the community are constituting themselves, are deciding on the rules that shall govern them, that means that all of the inequalities that govern society are going to be reflected in our politics. Now, I think that there's no alternative. We live in society. Any politics is going to come out of society. But it makes me think, according to sort of a democratic theory, maybe we need to say what happens in the Reddits is good, even if what we have are some subreddits that are racist, homophobic, hierarchical. I mean, that the democratic public is a site in which struggles over the nature of social relations are themselves occurring, but that means that it's not going to be beautiful. Lots of it's not going to be beautiful. Lots of it is going to be terrible. I don't know. So I guess I have a certain hesitation about how much we want to constrain the ability of some to influence others, of these forms of sort of what we might think of as bad forms of interaction and social value can be expressed in the mass public sphere.
Yeah, I would have more to say on this, but I think there are more questions.
Yeah.
There are more questions. Is there I am making a rule in the public sphere. Is there a student out there that has a question of the people who are left with questions? You want to raise your hand and go for it? Matthew, go for it.
Sure, I'm a student. No, thank you. One thing I appreciated is that both of you, while this is kind of a talk ostensibly focused on the online public sphere, it's been put in context both historically and in terms of other forms of mediation and the idea that all interaction is mediated. At the same time, I find myself thinking a lot about the impact of the way that different platforms or different arenas mediate that in different ways. The late anthropologist Jeff Juris, wrote that Twitter generates a logic of aggregation that's different from, he compared it to listservs with their logic of networking. And so I guess I wanted to ask I wondered if you could speak a little bit, not so much just to control of these platforms within the public sphere, but of the modes of them, how much even little things like a character limit, as we've discussed, shape the nature of the interaction, the temporality of the online, as opposed to something like newsletters or periodicals, just how that all shapes it.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, so look, if you look at Twitter, for example, what does it have? 142 characters per message. That does a great deal to what you can say and how you can say it and what discourse mean or what argument would mean. Probably very little, right? So it also means that you have to do a lot of kind of mobilizing work rhetorically with very little that you do. So if it encourages a very strong emotive kind of statement just by the fact that you have to be very brief. You just have to get all of this done, sort of relatively quickly. But you have these modalities in the one way or the other. One has to look in detail how the mediation really works with every single platform and to say what sorts of speaking, what kind of epistemic effect it has, of what you can do with style and what you cannot do with style, sort of on these various kinds of technology platforms. As television has its own modality, right? So in the way that you are addressing people, that is very different from radio, that is very different from a newspaper article. They all have different ways for drawing on participation and in the way that you can produce and perform in front of others. But there's a lot of detailed work that one would have to do with any one of those. Yes.
Well, and also this question makes me reinforces my concern about private control. Because if we think, as Andreas was pointing to, that these choices about the means by which you engage really do affect the content, the quality, the nature of the conversation, then the fact that these are being made, sort of unilaterally without any collective decision input, even in the subreddits, right? It's still, there's limits to how much the people who are making the space, consuming the space, can choose these rules. I was just thinking about Michael Warner's wonderful book on publics and counterpublics, in which he says something like, when people address publics, they engage in struggles over the conditions that bring themselves together as a public. The making of publics is the meta-pragmatic work newly taken up by every text and every reading, which I think is lovely, but is also in some ways idealistic, because of course there are limits to the ability of the people who are participating in this public form of expression to control the conditions under which it occurs. I mean, Jack controls Twitter, what's his name? Precisely because these decisions really matter, I would want them to be much more subject to the control of those who use the platforms. I mean, I think, an ideal to imagine as an alternative to what we have right now is something that sort of is on the edges right now, the policy debate, but platform cooperatives, where the users actually control the conditions under which the platform occurs. That's very far from the situation we have today.
Thank you all. I know there are a lot of other questions, but we're bumping up against the end of our time together. I would guess we could have spent another 3 hours here talking about this. And as both of the speakers pointed out, this has been, the ideas that we've talked about in the public sphere have been we've been talking about them since the beginning of the public sphere, and we will be continue talking about them for as long as we have discourse. So if you have questions about the program, I know that Jim made the plug earlier about the Center on Democracy and the Democracy Curriculum, but also about hearing about any additional events that you'd be interested in and sending us ideas. I put my email in the chat. So if you want to hear more about the Parrhesia program for public discourse, send me an email, or if you want to have ideas about additional programming, send me an email and we can be in conversation about what the next event looks like. Thank you so much, Andreas and Genevieve, for your time and for really laying this out as the complex issue it is that will be contested throughout, has been contested throughout history, will continue to be contested. So thank you for that. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks for coming.
This is fun.